Mr. Speaker, I thank you for recognizing me for 30 minutes to speak on a topic, no matter where I go or what I speak on, or if I'm being interviewed somewhere. I'm not the only one. It's other members of Congress, too. And this isn't a Republican issue. This is a bipartisan issue that Republicans and Democrats, Mr. Speaker, confront wherever we go across the United States. And really, I think that it has to do with the fact that Americans cannot countenance the fact that when we had people who were serving us in harm's way, it appears that the United States of America, in one of the rarest occasions that anyone can recall, wasn't there for those who were serving us on foreign lines. And what I'm speaking of, Mr. Speaker, is the night of September 11th, 2012, what's known as Benghazi. People still say to us, Mr. Speaker, again, Republicans and Democrats alike, because this is clearly a bipartisan issue. They say to us, when will we get the definitive report on Benghazi? When will we get some answers on what happened on that night, September 11th, 2012? Because no American citizen should go and serve her country and not be protected by the nation that sent her there. Those who were killed that evening, Ambassador Chris Stevens, the first American ambassador to be killed in 30 years in the line of duty. Sean Smith, who was there that evening with our ambassador. And then also 2 men who gave their lives trying to protect our ambassador, Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods. They weren't on the scene very long when they finally arrived in Benghazi. The Senate intelligence report that came out said that perhaps 15 minutes had lapsed by the time they arrived on the scene until they were murdered by a sophisticated mortar fire on the roof of the annex. Well, let's go back a little bit, Speaker. Let's take a look at what we know to be true so far. We've had 2 reports that have been issued. One is from the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I commend every American to go to the Senate Intelligence Committee website and download that report. Read it for yourself. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. And you'll be shocked at what you read in these findings. Now, the media didn't pick it up. The report came out. It's true. It was reported in the media. It's true that there had been a report. But what the findings said about the lack of management and the lack of accountability coming out of the White House and the State Department, quite literally coming to the very doorstep of the President of the United States and of the Secretary of State, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's shocking. And shocking is the fact that to this day, there have virtually been no firings at the State Department for what happened at Benghazi, despite the fact of the report that was issued by the Senate Intelligence Committee, and despite the fact that this week the House Foreign Affairs Committee issued another report after another investigation of what occurred at Benghazi. You see, there was a report, Mr. Speaker, that was issued prior to this one. It was the Benghazi Accountability Review Board. But it's very curious that this Benghazi Accountability Review Board failed to interview the senior-most decision makers in the Department of State. The facility in Benghazi, the compound where Chris Stevens, Sean Smith lost their lives, that particular compound is managed by the State Department. It's run by the State Department. And I'd like to go over some of the findings this evening in the minutes that we have together. I'd like to go over some of the findings that were issued in this report. And as I urge my fellow citizens in the United States to go to the Senate Intelligence Committee and read the damning report and the conclusions of that report, I also encourage my fellow citizens to go to the House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs and download the report that was just issued this week, also in Benghazi. And the report is entitled, Mr. Speaker, Benghazi, Where is the State Department Accountability? Majority Staff Report, House Foreign Affairs Committee. The chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is a representative from the state of California, Mr. Ed Royce. And Mr. Ed Royce said in September of 2013, "The State Department cannot have a culture of accountability if no one, literally no one, is held accountable for the mismanagement and poor leadership of the Accountability Review Board itself identified." In other words, a report which in my mind, Mr. Speaker, was woefully inadequate in investigating Benghazi, what we'll call the ARB, the Accountability Review Board. Even that report said there were deficiencies in accountability at the State Department. We know there was woeful inadequacy, and this is something that has to be addressed. And I call on members of the media, wake up. Take a look at what the American people want to know, and that's answers. Answers about what led up to the night of September 11th, 2013 in Benghazi. Were there alerts? Were there reports? Did we have any idea that this tragedy was going to occur? Absolutely we do. That's what this report shows from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What happened that night? What did the President of the United States do? Why is it that the media has absolutely no curiosity when it comes to where the President of the United States was that evening when the battle ensued? It actually was an evening. In Washington, D.C., it was 3:40 in the afternoon. In the election that occurred in 2008, there were two Democrat candidates. There was Hillary Rodham Clinton and Barack Obama, who were vying to become the nominee of the Democrat Party. And one particular commercial was aired by Hillary Rodham Clinton. It was famously called the 3 a.m. commercial. And the question that the ad asked is, who would be the person that you want to answer the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning if a call comes for a tragedy, inferring a foreign policy tragedy? Well, the call did come, unfortunately, tragically, but it didn't come at 3 o'clock in the morning. It came at 3 in the afternoon. To be precise, Mr. Speaker, that call came in at 3:40 in the afternoon from a desperate security officer in Benghazi inside the U.S. compound who picked up the phone and made a call to the desk that he was to report to. That call immediately was transferred to the appropriate channels, and literally, Mr. Speaker, within minutes of the attack on the compound in Benghazi, the President of the United States was informed not only that our American compound was under attack in what can only be called one of the greatest hellholes of the world, but he was also informed that our ambassador went missing and other Americans as well. What would a commander-in-chief do? What did our commander-in-chief do? I don't know. As a member of Congress, I don't know where our commander-in-chief was that night. I don't know, as a member of Congress, what our commander-in-chief was doing that night. I do know, again, in 2008, Hillary Rodham Clinton said she would be the individual who should appropriately take that call. She was the Secretary of State at that time, on September 11th of 2012. Where was the Secretary of State? She was here in Washington, D.C. What did she do when that phone call came in? She has testified before the United States Congress in answer to questions. But let's take in review, again, for the few moments that we have, what this report states about that infamous evening. And to understand anything this tragic, Mr. Speaker, we need to understand the context of the time. That's what this report begins to lay out. The context. We know that in 2011, in May, our brave United States Special Forces took out the menace and the head of the al-Qaeda organization, Osama bin Laden. We're extremely grateful for the work that they did. But despite that blow to al-Qaeda's network, al-Qaeda wasn't done. And al-Qaeda still isn't done today. Al-Qaeda's influence continued to spread, and it spread well beyond Afghanistan and well beyond Pakistan. It had spread into the area of northern Africa. There was a disturbing trend that occurred in Libya, and there was a concern led by our President of the United States, Barack Obama. He stated that the United States needed to unilaterally go into Libya and begin bombing. The leader of Libya was a man named Muammar Gaddafi. He had been the head of Libya for a number of years. He is not a good actor. He is not someone that the United States would consider a friend. As a matter of fact, we had discovered that Gaddafi was hoping to start a nuclear program in Libya. Events ensued, and that program was stopped. Gaddafi changed his ways, so to speak, and Gaddafi actually became a partner in fighting the global war on terror and was, in fact, jailing Islamic terrorists in parts of Libya. Gaddafi was acting in this manner, and yet at that time, President Obama felt that he needed to go in and bomb Gaddafi. I severely disagreed with President Obama at the time, Mr. Speaker. This was the wrong action for the United States to take. President Obama didn't come to this body. He didn't seek permission from the United States Congress to declare war on Libya, which had not declared war on the United States. But President Obama literally sent in United States airplanes and began bombing Libya. At the time, Mr. Speaker, I was running to become President of the United States. At that time, I stated I was unalterably opposed to President Obama's policy. We should not be bombing in Libya, Mr. Speaker. That's what I said at the time. Why? Because we already knew that, especially in the eastern part of Libya, this was the #1 area where people were recruited, terrorists were recruited to come and kill American soldiers in Iraq. And this was also training grounds and training camps for al-Qaeda and other terrorist forces in eastern Libya. You see, Mr. Speaker, if President Obama went forward, I said at the time, and bombed Libya and created instability, the question would be, who would take over for Muammar Gaddafi? Who would fill the leadership void? The only competing power structure was terrorist forces. Arguably, I said at the time, Mr. Speaker, we could even conceivably see al-Qaeda come in to fill the void, and Libya, being a nation that's not a poor nation, they have oil revenues that finance that country, and I was there recently speaking with the Prime Minister, with the head of the Justice Ministry, and also the Foreign Affairs Ministry. This is a nation that has a great deal of infrastructure, particularly in the Tripoli area, and there's revenues that have come in. So if the United States would go in, as President Obama wanted to do and did in fact do in Libya, we could see that there would be bombing, destabilization, there would be a fight for power. We could see terrorist elements come in, those elements that would be in line with the goals and objectives of al-Qaeda, and we could see oil revenues used and go into the pockets of those engaged in terror to continue to finance global terrorist activities. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what has happened in this region. That's what President Obama's foreign policy in Libya led to terrorists being on the march. And that's the context of the time that led up to that infamous night, September 11th, 2012. In that disturbing trend that was occurring in Libya, after a near total collapse after President Obama's ill-timed and unfortunate bombing in Libya, in June of 2012, there was nearly 1,000 Islamist militants that had converged on the courthouse in downtown Benghazi. They came in one night with 150 to 200 vehicles. For 2 days, they had a rally that was sponsored by the terrorist organization known as Ansar al-Sharia. This is in June of 2012, just a few months before September 11th. After this major rally that occurred also in June of 2012, an improvised explosive device, what we call an IED, blew a hole in the wall that surrounded this very same compound where Chris Stevens was tragically murdered on September 11th. So in June, there was a terrorist explosion that occurred just months on our compound. But that was the second explosion and attack that occurred on our compound. That was the second attack on that compound. So did we have notice? We absolutely had notice prior to that time with that second attack. But elsewhere in Benghazi, the United Kingdom, our closest ally and intelligence partner, English-speaking partner, shuttered their office. They withdrew from their staff after a rocket-propelled grenade attacked the British ambassador's convoy and 2 security officers were injured. It wasn't just the UK that pulled out of Benghazi, Mr. Speaker. The United Nations pulled out, and the International Red Cross pulled out. The U.S. flag was one of the only Western flags that remained flying in Benghazi. Did we know? Did Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton know? Did President Barack Obama know that Benghazi was in a terribly precarious state up to his re-election in the fall of 2012? Absolutely, they knew what a precarious situation this is, because it was our U.S. intelligence agencies that did their job. What have the investigations shown? U.S. intelligence agencies did their job. They extensively warned not only President Obama, but also Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that there was a deteriorating security environment in eastern Libya, including the expanding operation of al-Qaeda in that region, and that it mounted a significant risk to United States personnel and to United States facilities. You see, this is the first question that needs to be addressed. Did the President of the United States know this was a volatile situation? The answer is undoubtedly yes. Did Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have ample warning? Did she know that this was a real concern, that Benghazi could potentially be under attack? The question is, without a doubt, absolutely, yes, she did. As a matter of fact, it was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton herself who stated before Congress in testimony that she well understood and, quote, was certainly aware of this reporting by our intelligence community, as well as the fact that extremists claiming to be affiliated with al-Qaeda were active in the area in Benghazi. And still, after the United Kingdom pulled out and left, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made the decision that the United States would remain. After the United Nations pulled out, Secretary of State Clinton made the decision the United States would remain. After the International Red Cross pulled out, Secretary of State Clinton made the decision the United States and our ambassador would stay and remain in a facility that was not secure to avoid attacks. As a matter of fact, the United States taxpayers paid for hundreds of analytical reports that were done and completed by our intelligence services that provided strategic warning that militias and terrorists and affiliated groups that had not only the capacity but the intent to strike the United States and Western facilities and personnel in Libya could in fact do that. In fact, we even had a report that was entitled, in June of 2012, Libya, Terrorists are now targeting U.S. and Western interests. Could we have been any more clear? Could the Intelligence Committee have been any more clear? They issued a bulletin to our President and our Secretary of State, Libya, terrorists now targeting U.S. and Western interests, and still they made the decision that our vulnerable facility would remain open. Well, what happened? A lieutenant colonel in our military named Andrew Wood, before and after these attacks, he appealed to Washington for added security in Benghazi. He knew. He was a military man. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Wood, he led a U.S. military team. He asked for supplemental diplomatic security in Libya, and he recommended that the State Department consider pulling out of Benghazi altogether after the UK left and the UN left and the International Red Cross left. But his warnings weren't heeded. In fact, tragically, his warnings went unheeded. And despite the growing danger in Libya, State Department officials in Washington denied the request made by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Wood. When Andrew Wood said, we should get out of Benghazi, and he was told no, he said, well, if we're going to stay in Benghazi, at least add more security. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Wood was denied. He was told, no, we're not going to give you more security in Benghazi. In fact, they took away security in Benghazi. This was after the compound was attacked with an IED explosive device. This was after a rocket-propelled grenade was fired at the British ambassador's convoy, and the UK left, and the International Red Cross left. Numerous incidents. In fact, 16 different incidents, terror incidents, occurred in 2012. And despite the pleas from the military for more security, Secretary of State Clinton, as the Secretary of State, did not give in to those requests. The President of the United States did not give in to the request for additional security. And yet our ambassador remained on that infamous night of September 11th, 2012, without adequate security. It was a tragic loss of life. I believe a preventable loss of life. But what is even worse from that consequence, if there can be anything worse than this loss of life, is that that very action emboldened America's enemies. Our adversaries saw what we did in the midst of this heightened terrorist activity. They saw we did nothing to protect our ambassador. And when they killed our ambassador that night, they saw exactly how the United States responded. We did not have military on the ground. I'm not faulting our military. Mr. Speaker, what I am faulting and what I am suggesting is that the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, despite ample warning, did not put the United States military on high alert in this volatile region. What other region of the earth besides Afghanistan would have had this level of violence on that particular night, especially after there were already protests going on in nearby Cairo, and especially after threats had been made by terrorists of retaliatory actions in the Libya region? It is shocking to me, Mr. Speaker, shocking that the President of the United States, despite this knowledge, failed to do anything in response to the pleas for additional security, or at minimum, pulling our ambassador out of that region. Yes, we have answers. We have answers, and we still have more questions. Well, committee members in the Foreign Affairs Committee demanded that appropriate State Department officials be held accountable for these decisions, as they rightly should, so that these mistakes wouldn't be repeated. Yet neither the White House nor the State Department have stepped up to the responsibility. Instead, the Accountability Review Board, which did the first review, was seriously deficient. They failed to even comment on the actions of our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, or the most senior officials in the State Department. Now, why is this? Could it be because Secretary of State Hillary Clinton herself selected 4 out of the 5 review members? You see, isn't it convenient, Mr. Speaker, when it's our Secretary of State who gets to decide who sits on her own Accountability Review Board, overlooking the actions of what happened on that infamous night? She selected 4 out of the 5 that sat on that phony review board. Those are my words, no one else's. So when she is selecting 4 out of 5 of those who are going to review potentially her actions, is it any wonder then, Mr. Speaker, that this Accountability Review Board, if that's what you want to call it, decided, we don't think that we'll even interview Secretary of State Clinton. We don't think we need to talk to her. We don't think we need to talk to any of the senior decision makers in State Department. Oh no. So they chose to bypass even interviewing those who were the decision makers. Well, Mr. Speaker, that sounds a lot to me like the IRS. After this terrible scandal that's going on in the IRS, where they appears to be in a corrupt manner trying to deny to conservative Tea Party organizations their tax-exempt status, the IRS also decided not to interview any of the victims. How can you have an investigation of the IRS when they don't even interview the victims? How can you have an accountability review board if you don't even interview the decision makers in the State Department, including the Secretary of State and her top advisors? This is embarrassing. If it wasn't even more tragic, because again, we're talking about the unprecedented loss of life of 4 Americans, including our ambassador. Well, Secretary of State Clinton herself championed the United States going into Libya, going back to as early as 2011. She testified before the committee that she was engaged in the issues relating to the deteriorating threat environment in Libya. Well, that's pretty interesting, Mr. Speaker. You see, both Hillary Rodham Clinton, the Secretary of State, and President Obama believed that the United States of America unilaterally needed to go into Libya and start bombing. That was their agreed upon decision. And when the chips were down and when the threat environment was deteriorating in Libya, and when Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Woods said, hey, we got a problem here in Benghazi, and we've got to either pull out or we have to have more security, and the Secretary of State and those who serve under her don't heed those warnings, not only do they not pull out of Benghazi, but they don't give the increased security that was required to keep the Americans who are serving us safe. When they do that, then that's a problem. What's an additional problem, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that at the State Department, not one employee was fired or even missed a paycheck over what happened at Benghazi. I would imagine, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of Americans that don't know that despite this tragedy, despite this lack of accountability, of anyone being held responsible. Oh, yes, we heard that there were 4 people who were going to lose their jobs. My foot, Mr. Speaker. 4 people didn't lose their jobs at the State Department. 2 were reassigned. 1 retired. Another one had another similar situation. No one was fired. No one even missed a paycheck. What we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is listen to the good common sense of the American people who are demanding answers. What in the world happened in this lead up before Benghazi? We need to hold the Secretary of State and the President accountable for what they knew and failed to make the important common sense decisions that any commander-in-chief should make. We need to ask that second question. What in the world was the President of the United States doing that night when the attack happened in Benghazi? For over 8 hours, Americans were under attack, and no one came to their aid or assistance other than those who were at the annex, who came and were willing to lay down their lives, and those who came from Tripoli. It took them hours and hours, but they were finally able to come to assist their comrades in arms. And then also the third question that needs to be addressed, Mr. Speaker, is this. What happened after that night in Benghazi? Why did Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, why did President Barack Obama continue to force the false fiction that there was a video that no one saw, that was the cause for a spontaneous outbreak that led to the deaths of these 4 Americans in Benghazi? We've listened to people who were on the ground in Benghazi. They stated overwhelmingly this attack was not spontaneous, it was planned. And yet for weeks afterwards, the President of the United States, as late as September 25th, when he went to the United Nations, he made a statement. This was after 4 Americans were killed. The President of the United States said this at the UN. He said, "The future does not belong to those who insult the prophet." Those were his words. We need to get answers. And again, I encourage the American people, Mr. Speaker, read this valuable report issued this week by the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House of Representatives on Benghazi. I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman